The iPhone SE, which is quickly approaching its 3rd anniversary, was an amazing phone when it was released. It gave us a device with that timeless classic design of the iPhone 5S with modern specs borrowed from the iPhone 6S, which was released a few months prior. With the news that Apple recently sold out of a clearance allotment of the iPhone SE, it really got me thinking about this device again. Are people crazy for buying a nearly 3-year-old budget-minded iPhone in 2019? Watch as I revisit the iPhone SE, breaking down its current strengths and weaknesses. Thanks for watching 9 to 5 Mac. Be sure to thumbs up, click the subscribe button, and then enable notifications with the bell icon so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Welcome to the Rewind. For me, the iPhone 5 era design, with its squared off instead of rounded sides and the refined chamfered edges of the iPhone SE, represents the pinnacle of Apple design for its phones. The iPhone SE also lacks a camera bump, which became an unfortunate staple of iPhones back starting with the iPhone 6. The lack of a camera bump allows for a completely smooth and cohesive back cover, lending to the device's overall beauty. It's such a timeless design that even the new iPad Pro has adopted a similar look, albeit with a camera bump. Needless to say, I'd love to see a modern take on this design for the iPhone. In an era of unwieldy phones, Apple bucked trends with the iPhone SE, jamming modern, well at the time, features into a small, easy-to-handle form factor. Apple realized in 2016 what it seems to have forgotten in the years that followed. Not everyone needs or even likes huge phones like the iPhone XS Max. Featuring a mere 4-inch display, the iPhone SE easily fits in the hand or inside a pocket or purse. In other words, this phone is super low-key, which is something I can definitely appreciate as a current iPhone XS Max user. With the release of iOS 12, performance on Apple hardware actually improved across the board, making older phones like the iPhone SE feel faster than before. The iPhone SE, with its Apple A9 system on a chip and 2 GB of RAM, still works well today. Remember, this is basically an iPhone 6S crammed into the body of an iPhone 5S. In 2018, all of Apple's new iPhone releases featured Face ID instead of Touch ID, but the iPhone SE, of course, comes bundled with Touch ID, which quite a few people still have an affinity for. Even though the iPhone SE comes with a first-generation Touch ID sensor, I find that it's still good enough to provide a seamless experience overall. The iPhone SE was released in the spring of 2016, a few months before the iPhone 7 was released without a headphone jack. That means that the iPhone SE was actually the last iPhone Apple released with a headphone jack in tow, and that alone elevates the device in the eyes of some. Using the same 12-megapixel camera with f2.2 aperture from the iPhone 6S, the rear-facing camera inside the iPhone SE is surprisingly good and still holds up relatively well to this day. Not only does it take good photos, but it can also take live photos like the iPhone 6S and newer devices. Perhaps even more impressive is the fact that the camera found inside the iPhone SE can take 4K video at 30 frames per second. Entry-level SE models only came with 16 GB of storage, and because 4K video takes up so much space, I feel like this feature was often overlooked. Looking at the specs, battery life for the iPhone SE is surprisingly decent when compared to modern iPhones. For instance, the iPhone SE boasts 13 hours of internet usage on LTE and 13 hours of video playback. To put that into perspective, the iPhone XS features 12 hours of internet use and 14 hours of video playback. Granted, when you consider other factors such as talk time, the iPhone XS begins to fare better. The 16GB iPhone SE started at $400 when it was released, but over time Apple doubled the storage, ditching a low-tier 16GB version for the same price. In terms of budget phones, the $399 entry-level price for the iPhone SE was a much more palatable option than the so-called budget iPhone XR, which starts at $750. And at the recent $249 clearance price for the 32GB iPhone SE model, the phone almost leans into impulse buy territory. Should you have paid the $299 $349 clearance price that Apple offered recently on its website, thinking about what we just discussed, nostalgia may have tempted you, but you'd be wise to consider some of the more inferior aspects about the iPhone SE, and that's what we're going to do right now. As an iPhone XS Max user, going back to the iPhone SE for the last week has been very interesting to say the least. It's been a great experience as far as portability and hand comfort is concerned, two huge factors to be sure, but the phone leaves a lot to be desired in 2019. Let's take a look. It's not just that the displays on the recent iPhones are so much bigger when compared to the 4-inch display on the iPhone SE, it's that modern iPhone displays are so much better. The massive 6.5-inch display on the iPhone XS Max definitely stands out, but it's the quality of said display, the resolution, contrast ratio, viewing angles, wide color support, that's what makes it really special. Screen real estate is obviously a huge differentiating factor as well. The iPhone XR and the XS Max, for instance, provide massive upgrades in space on screen. As a result, users have access to more rows of icons on the home screen, larger videos, and more text on screen when reading the web, books, and messages. The next obvious difference between the iPhone SE and modern iPhones is the camera quality. The 12-megapixel camera in the iPhone SE with its support for 4K video is far from terrible, but it can't compete with the silicon and AI advancements in Apple's latest hardware. Apple's latest iPhones also feature 12-megapixel wide-angle rear cameras, but with significantly faster f1.8 apertures and faster sensors. Although the iPhone XR lacks the dual rear camera array, all of Apple's recent smartphone releases have excellent cameras with features simply not available on the SE. Even the budget-minded iPhone XR with its single rear camera lens has larger pixels and features like portrait mode for depth control on the fly or in post. There's also niceties like 4K video at 60 frames per second and 1080p 240 frames per second slow motion. And here's the thing that really stands out. The front-facing camera, which was downright laughable on the iPhone SE, is also a huge improvement on modern iPhones. Not only is the true depth front-facing camera on recent iPhones capable of Face ID biometric authentication, but it's also a 7-megapixel shooter capable of capturing 1080p video up to 60 frames per second. Folks, that is a noteworthy upgrade over the paltry 1.2 megapixel camera that migrated from 2013's iPhone 5S to the iPhone SE. Recent iPhone releases have improved a lot as far as sound quality is concerned, and much of that can be attributed to just having more room to move sound around. The iPhone SE has a single puny speaker located at the bottom of the handset, while new iPhones feature stereo speaker setups that are significantly louder and clearer than the single speaker setup on the iPhone SE. Now that modern iPhones, and iPads as well, lack a home button, gesture controls are used for almost everything when it comes to interfacing with the device. For example, swiping up from the bottom of the screen to go back to the home screen feels more natural than pressing the home button. And the swipe up and briefly hold gesture feels like a more efficient way to invoke the app switcher. I much prefer controlling my iPhone this way than the old way. 3D Touch debuted on the iPhone 6s, which is sort of ironic when you consider that the iPhone SE is essentially an iPhone 6s and an iPhone 5s body. At any rate, 3D Touch, which relies on special pressure-sensitive components, wasn't included with the iPhone SE. Often described as sort of a right-click for iOS devices, 3D Touch allows users to invoke shortcuts directly from the home screen and peek and pop to preview and open content in supported apps. It's a great feature. Unfortunately, 3D Touch wasn't included on Apple's so-called budget flagship, the iPhone XR, which, coupled with the fact that the iPad still doesn't have 3D Touch, doesn't give me a lot of confidence in the future of the technology. I was skeptical at first about Face ID, but after having it for a year with the iPhone X and after having enjoyed the upgraded version on the iPhone XS Max, I'm firmly convinced that it's a better biometric solution than Touch ID. Touch ID had its time and place to be sure, but it feels a little old when compared to Face ID, which doesn't require the user to do anything other than look at their phone for it to unlock and authenticate within apps. After going without wireless charging for numerous iPhone generations, Apple finally jumped on board with the Qi wireless charging standard with the release of the iPhone X. That iPhone also gained access to faster USB power delivery charging at the same time. During my revisit with the iPhone SE, this was one of the most glaring differences between the old and new hardware for me, as I'm used to sitting my iPhone on various wireless chargers around the house and in the car. Not having wireless charging was definitely an inconvenience that I noticed. One of the features that I ended up missing most during my time with the iPhone SE was tap to wake. I know that kind of seems silly, but seriously, this feature, which debuted with Apple's first OLED phone, the iPhone X, is a convenient way to wake up your phone by simply tapping on the screen, whereas the iPhone SE requires a physical button press or for you to raise the device to wake it. The iPhone XS with its 6-core Apple A12 Bionic chip is in a whole different league as far as performance is concerned. But for someone who is okay with using an iPhone SE in 2019, it's likely that performance isn't as big of a priority as other factors may be on this list. With that said, the A12 is a massive improvement over the A9 and the iPhone SE. Not only are such advancements made evident from games and benchmarks, but it also allows for other enhancements such as real-time machine learning, augmented reality, and more. As you might expect, graphics are much improved as well with a 4-core Apple-designed GPU with Metal 2 support in Apple's modern phones. There's also an 8-core neural engine for on-device machine learning and an enhanced image signal processor that allows for things like portrait mode and smart HDR for increased dynamic range in photos. With everything we've discussed in this video, it brings about one obvious question. Should Apple release a modern take on the iPhone SE? What do you guys think? Thumbs up if you agree. Personally, I think all of Apple's future phones should adopt design language similar to the SE, but I also think it's a good idea to release a smaller budget iPhone inspired by the highly adored iPhone SE. Imagine for a moment an all-screen, nearly bezel-free design with iPhone 5S era design cues. That alone would allow the SE to have far greater on-screen real estate while retaining a similar physical footprint. Now imagine for a second a camera similar to the iPhone XR, a faster A12 Bionic chip, an OLED display, and features like Face ID and Tap to Wake. That sounds like an iPhone that would be insanely popular for those who dislike large phones. In fact, it would be insanely popular for everyone, I think. The original iPhone SE was a great phone, no doubt, but it's a phone that's lacking a lot in 2019. If form factor trumps everything else, then it's an obvious choice. You might want to stick with the iPhone SE. But if other factors weigh in on your opinion, and I think they should, I think it would be very hard to justify purchasing an iPhone SE in 2019. What do you guys and gals think? Is the iPhone SE worth purchasing today? Should Apple release an updated version? Would you prefer it as a budget model over the iPhone XR? Feel free to sound off down below in the comments with your thoughts and opinions. Also be sure to subscribe and thumbs up this video if you appreciated it. Thanks for watching, everyone. This is Jeff with 9 to 5 Mac.